So many of you may recall that 35, 40 years ago, there was a book that came out by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on death and dying. And the stages of death defined our culture. They gave us a roadmap. They gave us a language, and they gave us a cultural understanding of the transition that we face. This book is of that magnitude and of that cultural significance. And so, yes. So we'll start at the beginning. Would you share with us, as a psychologist who sees many cases, how did you decide to write this book on trauma and post-traumatic growth?
Yes. And some of you know this story, but I love telling stories
Please.
like this, and some of it is in my book, some of it is not. I grew up in a community of immigrants, Holocaust survivors, refugees, and part of my questioning since I was a little girl was, how come some people can go through life and do really well? How come other people not do so well? What makes a difference? I was always super curious about how people go about life, which of course got me to study psychology. I think it also comes from not only from the experiential life, but also inherited in our bodies, in our DNA. So probably we're going to talk later as well. And one of my questions was always like, how do people go through this extreme experiences? My two grandparents on my mother's side are Holocaust survivors. They were sole survivors of concentration camps. And I'm like, how do people go with life after this? How people go through, Ukraine war and continue life? How people have, have sexual abuse and then continue, or have a huge accident or loss or death, and like, how do they do? And I saw a variety of reactions and responses. And that got me to really study trauma from the very beginning, and this is more than 25 years ago. But as I was developing in the study of trauma, and back then, trauma was not the word that it is now. Back then, trauma, people didn't even know what that was. Nobody talked about it. Judith Herman was writing her book, about trauma and recovery. And it was like, what do you mean trauma? But then it developed more into not just what trauma is, but what happens after and how people really recover. And that's why part of what this book is not really about trauma, but it's what happens after trauma. So I started seeing all this growth, all this transformation, all these things and wow, this is interesting. This is what really happens after the people. So there was a group of people that were pretty traumatized and got stuck. As you know, trauma fragments, trauma isolates, trauma shatters your life and your belief system about you, about the others, about the world. So some people were stuck in that repetitive place of trauma. Some other people were more resilient. The people had some way of bouncing back, were able to recover, were able to move forward and heal. So, but there was a special group of people that were not just recovering but thriving. They really, really did something with their lives that was very different, and they were really evolving and transforming, and they became something else, and they did something with their lives that was very meaningful. And that was really what caught my attention the most. So I kept looking for examples of that. I worked with Cambodian refugees in the Bronx, in New York, 25 years ago. And they were amazing examples of that, of post-traumatic growth. And then I worked with immigrants in Central America, and there were examples of post-traumatic growth. Then I worked with torture survivors in Bellevue Hospital in New York, examples of that. And over, that was what I saw in my practice as well. So that to me was pretty interesting, and I think that's what got me to say, hey, let's focus on how can we make this an opportunity, a springboard for transformation. There's a hope of not trauma being a life sentence, but a springboard for transformation, a roadmap to evolution, an opportunity for greater consciousness and greater awareness and greater meaningful life.
Can anyone be helped along that path?
So that's a question that a lot of people ask me all the time. Can anybody go through this process of post-traumatic growth? The answer is yes, anybody. But I want to say with that, that it's also a very, very difficult process. Post-traumatic growth is both an outcome and it's a process. It means, and let me just define what post-traumatic growth is. Post-traumatic growth is the positive psychological changes that happen to a person after going through challenging adversity, challenging experiences in life. It's both a process and an outcome. That means that you have to do the work. There's no going around it. The way out is through. You know, I'm sure you've heard this. This is the way to do it. So some people are willing to do it. Some people are not willing to do it. There's a beautiful poem that by Anais Nin, a writer, that said, when the risk of staying in the bud is more painful than the risk of blossoming, that's when the transformation happens. Something like that. But you know, it's that idea, like when you cannot tolerate pain any longer and staying where you are, that's where people begin to say, okay, there has to be something else, because the suffering is too much.
In discussions of trauma, and in the way trauma is often spoken of in our culture, people often say how important resilience is in facing trauma. But you raised the very interesting point that resilience can actually get in the way of post-traumatic growth.
Yes, and this is a controversial, I love talking about this because it's a little bit controversial, and people in my field, that some of my colleagues here, know this. Resilience is another of those words, like, it's in fashion. Everything is resilient and it's all resilience, and I love the word, don't get me wrong. But I went through the phase of that being one of my favorite words. But I want to tell you something. People can be very resilient. There are some studies that show that some people are born with more resilience than others, some people develop more resilience, and that's wonderful and great. And I encourage that. And if we're resilient and we have the tools to go about it, let's use them. To go through a deep transformation, sometimes resiliency is an obstacle. It prevents you. Why? Because going through a transformation is something where you have to touch a very dark, obscure, shattered place in life. And that gives me a chance to. Who knows what the cover of this book means? Yeah. Anybody here? 2 people? No way, 3 people. No, but I told you. No, please, can you raise your hands if you know what the cover of this book means? Yes? Yeah, right. Yeah, no, because I was going to say, whomever knows, you have 15 minutes of free consultation with me. I always do this test. So this is a really beautiful, you guys know that I love art, right? I can't live without art and music. So of course I had to include art in this project as well. So this is called kintsugi. Kintsugi is a Japanese technique based on the wabi-sabi philosophy. I mean, I'm not an expert, but enough to know the beautiful meaning of what kintsugi is. As you know, in Japan, all these vases that are very magnificent, that are ancestral, that have a lot of value, are very well regarded. When those vases are broken, what do you think they do with the pieces? They don't throw them away. Unlike the society that we live in, that everything is, ¿cómo se dice? Disposable, ¿verdad? A little bit of Spanish I need to talk. So in those vases actually are being kept, and then they use this technique that has lacquered gold powder, and they use that to put the pieces back together. And the interesting thing is that not only that the vase, of course, looks different because of the golden cracks, but the vase has more value now, which is an incredible thing. Why? Because it's showing the test of time. It's showing that it had experiences. It's showing that it's transformed into something else. And to me, that's such a moving example of what post-traumatic growth is. I love, that graphic, illustration of it. It's like where the butterfly has to transform the caterpillar into the butterfly. That transformation, I was reading about it. It's actually in my book a little bit. What happens inside the caterpillar, inside the bud, the larva, or it's like it gets destroyed inside. Like there are juices and acids and everything that gets, pretty much the butterfly dies. That thing dies, and then it's reborn again. And that's really what needs to happen for this kind of transformation to be part of a human being. And some people are willing to go through this rebirthing, and some people are not. Some people are capable, some people are not. Some people have the chance to do it, and some people are not. But that's why I'm saying, like, resilience sometimes prevents us, because people that are resilient can go through life, and it's great. Maybe you don't need to go through that, deep transformation. But sometimes, that thing of letting go and allowing yourself to go deeply into all this process, it takes a lot of courage sometimes. And by the way, we don't do it alone like anything else in life. We always do it in relationships. In relationships, either with a professional, with a community, with a guru, with your yoga teacher, with your family member, but we do it in relationships.
You share that trauma is actually contagious. What do you mean by that, and how can the transmission be stopped?
Yeah, by now I'm sure that you've heard this, the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And I know the word contagious can sound a little bit like the pandemic. And when I was writing this book, I'm like, should I use this word? This is the thing. A lot of the things that we learn in life are the beliefs and the examples and the behaviors that we get from our parents and from our family and from our culture. And most of the time we repeat them. Sometimes without really being aware when we're repeating. Sometimes we are aware, but we cannot help it, and we keep repeating it. Has that happened? That happened, right? You know that you're repeating it, and you keep doing it, right? So that creates, sometimes when we're talking about trauma, that creates the passing of trauma from generation to generation. So, for example, I had a case that's super interesting. This woman, beautiful woman from Colombia, she actually wrote a book about this afterwards. And she was pretty much having a very average life. She got married, she had children. One day, she's in the park, and she's looking at her 5-year-old playing in the park. And she's sitting there looking at her daughter, whatever. And then all of a sudden, she has this flashback of herself, 5-year-old, playing in the park. And she sees like her cousins around and her family, like some of the boys in her family. This was back in Colombia. And she gets this like shock. She's like, oh my God, I was sexually abused. I was sexually raped, my family, I was molested. And she began to reconnect when she was 5 years old. Her daughter reminded her of her. And she started to work on this understanding of her life and how she was transmitting some of her behaviors about the beliefs of men, about the beliefs of family, about trusting, about what it means to be in the world, how dangerous the world is or not. Because one of the things that trauma does is that breaks the innocence. And sometimes, and innocence doesn't mean like just when the kids are innocent. It's like that belief in ourselves and others that everything is okay. And until we go through a very, very traumatic experience, we believe that everything is okay, that the world is okay. Sometimes, for example, the pandemic. But it took a global pandemic for some people to say, what? The world is not safe? You mean that governments cannot protect us from getting sick and dying? You mean that the whole world can be in chaos like that? That took the innocence of a lot of cultures or a lot of societies or a lot of families, right? And that shattering of the belief is it then gets transmitted and repeated, and that's what creates the cycle of trauma. Why I think this is so important? Because when we're not aware of this, what do? We are the enablers of this cycle of trauma to happen over and over and over from generation to generation. So there's a term for people that stop this trauma that is called the breaker of the cycle. It's like the one person in the family that breaks the cycle. And it's like it takes that person consciously to say, I know what we're going through, I know that, and sometimes it's the black sheep in the family, sometimes it's that member in the family that nobody understands, that it's outcast, that it's like that person is crazy. That sometimes that's the person that is saying, enough of this repetition over and over, and I'm doing something different. And then this transmission of trauma, what's interesting is that not only it's from behavior, but now we know that it's transmitted also in our genes. Who's heard of the word epigenetics? Yes. So epigenetics is something amazing and wonderful, right, that we know now. I always love it because it brings so much hope, which is we're no longer marked just by the information that we have in our genes and that we're stuck with that. Now we know that the expression of the genes that we carry in our DNA can be modified and affected by the experiences that we have in life. Can you imagine? And then we pass that on to our children and to our grandchildren. So imagine the responsibility that we have, right now, right here, to change the discourse, right? And to change what we're doing, because everything that we're doing can be sort of like recorded and expressed and not expressed in the genetic information that we pass on. In the same way that contagious trauma, I also want to say that post-traumatic growth is also contagious, meaning like in the same way that the negative things that are passed on, the positive things are passed on. So why is it important to know about post-traumatic growth? Because we can pass on all this wonderful growth, transformation, consciousness, not only to ourselves, but to our children and to our grandchildren. So yes, good for transformation, good for contagious.
Beautiful. You have a chapter on collective trauma and also on collective post-traumatic growth. Could you share a bit about that, how trauma can be experienced by a family, a community, even a culture?
Yes, and I wanted to make sure that we talk about collective, because one of the messages that I want to give in this book is that trauma not only is individual, but trauma is systemic. Trauma is collective. Healing is also systemic, is collective, is relational. What does it mean? At least the way I believe who we are and how we are in the world. I think my way of thinking is partly also because of my training, but also because of my experience, is that it's relational. I don't see we are individuals isolated and disconnected from anything else. I think we are part of a collective, part of a whole, always, all the time, everywhere, anywhere, what's the movie that just won? Everywhere, all the time, all at once, right? That's I believe in that. I believe in that connection. And sometimes what happens to a culture is shared. The pandemic is an example of the way I called it from the very beginning was collective trauma, right? Did you call it like that in New York also? Yeah. Collective trauma. I mean, we're all affected. Everybody's reacting differently, but it's something that we're sharing. The Holocaust is a collective trauma, right? The Ukraine war is a collective trauma. How are we going to do with this, next generations of kids that have gone through all this war, and how is it going to be affecting generation after generation, collectively? A lot of the cultures, have gone through extreme trauma. Black people in the United States. I hope I'm being politically correct in the way I'm talking, but this is traumas that have not been validated, that have not been acknowledged, that have not been recognized. When trauma is not recognized for any cultural indigenous people, Latin American, Venezuela, hello. I mean, let's talk about collective trauma. Again, that's why I think my motivation to work to write a book like this is like, let's be aware of our piece in this and our responsibility, right, in how we do. It doesn't matter what group you belong to, it doesn't matter what culture you are, it's taking responsibility as a family member, as a community member, a society member. How are you being part of the repetition of trauma, and what can we do to start the healing process? So thank you for that question.
Thank you. So the real heart of this extraordinary book is that you walk us through. You can literally feel Edith by your side. Her voice is so reassuring and present and whole. You walk us through a roadmap of the 5 steps of post-traumatic growth. And I'm wondering if you could walk us through the 5 steps here now.
Yes. So that's, the book has, the first part of the book is more the theoretical, and the second part of the book is more these 5 steps. And that's why I tell people just open the book and wherever you want, because you're going to find something that can be useful. Especially the second part if you just want to do practical stuff, because every step has some exercises and some ideas and some explanations. So Lisa gave me the idea to do AABBD. AABBT. That's our 5. So stage number 1 is, how do we start this process of post-traumatic growth? People ask me that all the time. The most important is radical acceptance. And I actually invite you, if you want to do this with me, pick something in your life right now. It doesn't have to be the most traumatic thing in your life, but pick something that you are thinking about that is difficult right now, that it's meaningful for you. And let's see if we can walk through these stages. So first stage is the stage of radical acceptance. It's awareness. And that stage of radical acceptance requires us to pause, look at ourselves, and truly become like very, very, like radically honest. Like, who am I? What's happening with me? What am I doing? What's going on? So the alcoholic or the addict is saying, yes, I'm an addict, or I'm an alcoholic, or yes, I was sexually abused, or yes, I'm an immigrant that is being completely traumatized by the experience of immigration, or yes, I got divorced and I'm completely messed up because of the divorce. So just that first step of recognizing that, which is not easy because we tend to avoid, pretend that it's not happening, dissociate, come up with the most creative techniques to not recognize that, right? Can somebody identify with that? Right? Eat chocolate, drink, shopping, pretending it's not, what else? Pretending, watching Netflix, pretending it's not happening, right? Going like all kinds of things that we do. So having the courage to say, yes, it's happening, it's a big step. But once you take that step, the process starts. Because what happens after that is the second stage of safety and protection. And it's like, okay, I need to reach out and maybe trust one person that I can tell the story to, I can tell them about. Sometimes it's a professional, psychologist, psychiatrist. Sometimes it's literally a yoga teacher. Sometimes it's a group of people that you do a pilgrimage with. Sometimes it's a meditation group on the beach. Your hairdresser, right? Your sister, right? Your family member, your best friend. That happens. And then you begin to trust and you begin to tell the story. Are you keeping track of your story? Like, well, how would you do this? Or have you done it? And then the third stage, which I love, is the stage of new narratives. So what happens? You begin to say, wow, yes, my life was shattered. Yes, I mean, I don't know what's happening after the pandemic. Everything is different. I have to reinvent myself, right? Like everybody was saying, I have to reinvent myself. I have to tell new stories. What do you do? How do you do that? What do you do? This is typical when people start reading new books, trying new theories, becoming, a believer in something, trying new clothes, move someplace else, like begin to understand life in a different way. You really are trying out new ways of seeing the world. I had a couple that came during the pandemic, by the way, who was completely in shock because she found out that he was cheating on her because, of course, they were in the pandemic the whole day, the two of them with their 4 children, and they saw the phone. She sees the phone. She sees all these messages on his phone, of course. She calls me, oh my God, I'm dying. I don't know what to do. Help me. My world is over. So they both came, and they started this process of transformation. By the time they got to the new narrative, the third stage, they were talking, like, how are we going to redefine our relationship? Because what we did for the last 20 years it's shit. It doesn't work anymore. Look where it got us. We need to do something different. And they began to try different ways of relating in all kinds of ways. Socially, sexually, emotionally. They talk to their kids about how they're going to do things differently. It's like a new contract in their relationship. Like when they rewrote a contract of their marriage. That's an example of new narratives. But the fourth stage
you call it becoming.
Becoming, yes. So awareness, awakening, becoming. The fourth one, being, it's the stage of integration. This is where you truly see yourself for who you are without discarding who you were before and what happened to you before. So like the kintsugi, like the vase, you don't discard the pieces. They're part of your journey. They're part of your growth. A beautiful example I have of somebody that she was going through a very difficult sexual abuse experience, and after she processed that, she decided to paint faces. One side of the face was the example of the abuse, and the other example of the face was the example of the illustration of her growth and her transformation. So it's holding both at the same time. It's doing different things, but saying, this is who I am. I am divorced, but I'm also, this other person. Or I'm an immigrant, and I'm also this. Or I am a survivor of, I lost my loved one in an accident, and I'm also something else. And then the fifth stage, which is the stage of transformation, the stage of growth and wisdom and growth. Of course, my favorite stage, because this is a stage when the person is truly benefiting from all the changes that happen, for all the new learned experiences. This is where you get to appreciate life in a different way. This is where your relationships are more meaningful. This is where there's an understanding of your priorities in a different way, right? Because you rewrite your priorities, you do something different, you understand the world and the relationships in a different way. This is where you turn the pain into purpose. This is where you go from the breakdown to the breakthrough. This is where the spiritual awakening happens. And by spiritual, as Dr. Miller knows, is not religious, it's an understanding of who you are in connection with everything else, that there's something bigger than yourself. We can talk more about that if you want. And there's usually people that are in this stage of post-traumatic growth. In the fifth stage, they turn all this knowledge into service for other people. Usually, this is where you see the alcoholic, the addict that becomes the mentor for other people. This is where you see my patient who was sexually abused write books about it and create a whole thing to support women on sexual abuse. This is where you see Oprah that went through a whole thing to create a whole, empire of how to make people talk and share their experiences. So we have tons of examples of post-traumatic growth, right? One of the things that I want to do is start interviewing people that are examples of post-traumatic growth to see, you can do this. This is something that you can achieve. This is happening every day, all the time, and it's beautiful to see. And it's beautiful to see how we are of service when we get to that part. So, AABBT.
AABBT. If we know this, we know where we stand, and we have some sense of bearing. And your presence is very strong in the book. You walk us through this. When we hold on to your model, it's as if we have a map. And instead of just being lost at sea, we know that we are in a place. There is a coordinate to where we are.
Yeah, and by the way, I didn't invent this. I'm actually describing what people go through. And of course, yes, I'm facilitating that in my office or the groups that I work with or whatever. But what I think it's so wonderful about this is to give language. Because every time I ask people, everybody tells me pretty much the same story. They tell me, Edith, you know what? I would have never wished this on anybody. I was working with people from 9/11 in New York. I would have never wished this on anybody. But I'm so grateful that this happened to me, because I would not have been who I am if this didn't happen. And this happens invariably to every person that I work with that gets to post-traumatic growth. So having the language to understand, okay, now I'm in radical acceptance. Okay, now I'm in this new narrative phase, or now I'm integrating. It really helps people say, okay, I'm describing where I am, I'm identifying, I'm becoming aware, and I have some expectation, not only for the person that is going through this, but for the caretaker or for the therapist or for the family that is saying, okay, you know, you're on the path. This is happening. We're doing well.
Yes. So once we reach post-traumatic growth, what happens? Do we sustain post-traumatic growth? Do we slide back? Are there ways we can help sustain wisdom?
Yes, and this chapter is called "Staying Elevated," and you know, this path, like anything else in life, is not linear. It's not like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We go back, we go forth, we go in circles. It's up and down. Maybe we grow in one aspect, but not in another. Maybe we're doing really well at work, but doing really bad in our personal relationships, or the other way around. Maybe we're doing great with our children, but doing horribly with our spouses, so our partner, life partner. So it doesn't apply like you know, rigidly. It's like you see how you're growing in different aspects in your life, and sometimes you're more inspired or more able to work in one thing and in another. So there are things to do always. It's always like keeping in mind, you already know that you went through this, that you can do it again. There's so many techniques that we can use, meditation and breathing, and of course being therapy, gracias Sammy. And I think some practice that helps you stay in a belief system that helps you move on. So many things are staying elevated, you know. One of the, I'll say when I put the, I was going to say something about Peter Pan, but I'll do it later.
You share very, very beautifully that an important aspect of post-traumatic growth is spirituality, spiritual deepening, spiritual awareness. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yes, and actually this is a good segue into my synchronicities.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so she loves synchronicities. This is what happened. I want to tell this story that it's not about the content of the book, but how the book came about. So, who knows me knows that I'm like all over the place all the time. I love being everywhere and do a million things. So when I decided this, I wrote this 23 years ago because it was part of my doctoral dissertation. I have to stand up. Then that was one synchronicity. Then I'm writing about my chapter in collective trauma because I was gonna, and unfortunately, the Surfside building collapsed. So I was having like real-time examples and experiences in every chapter that I was writing, and some of them were painful. I mean, I'm like, here I am writing about collective trauma and living it, living everything. Then I was writing about grief and about, you know, loss and about ambiguous loss. And my father, you know, got sick, and you know, he eventually died. And I'm like living it, living the loss, living the life. So it was like no excuses for I was writing because it became so personal, everything that I went through. Then I got to the post-traumatic growth part, and specifically about spirituality, because it's one of the things about post-traumatic growth. And all of a sudden, I don't know from where, I get this book, because I'm always looking for books and buying books and books and books, and I get this book that says The Awakened Brain. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. And I start reading the book, and it's all about spirituality and growth and trauma, and I'm like, no, this is incredible. Perfect for my chapter, you know, and that's her book. And yes, and I made, then I sent it to my editor, and I'm like, read this book in one day, you have to read this book, it's amazing. Then I gave a talk on spirituality and trauma, and I made 25 people read the book. Because everything that happened in like a perfect, then, for example, I was writing about radical acceptance, and I keep getting patients in my practice, because, you know, I see patients every day, talking exactly about that stage. And then the other one, exactly, I mean, it was incredible, the synchronicities. At some point, I'm like, okay, universe, God, thank you. I don't need any more. You know, I'm done with the synchronicities, because some of them were very painful to live through. And but it really informed me in such a personal way. And I think that's part of the spirituality that I think we're talking about in post-traumatic growth. And what I love about it is that, thanks to her, there's scientific evidence of how spirituality is a protective factor in our growth. So people that have gone through trauma and then because of that dark night of the soul, because of that rebirthing, develop some spirituality, some connection, then there's evidence in the cerebral cortex, specifically in the brain, left. There's a part of the cerebral cortex that becomes thicker, and it's evidence of developed spirituality. But what's beautiful about that, I haven't told you this, but what's beautiful about that is that it's a protective factor for future trauma, and that's what I love. That it's not only that it develops after a very difficult experience, but it's afterwards. It protects you from other more difficult experiences. So like that, many other things in post-traumatic growth are very, very meaningful in this development and evolution. So thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful. Stepping back, one of the deepest themes in your beautiful book is that trauma happens in relationship and trauma is healed, post-traumatic growth in relationship.
Yeah, I think that's one of the messages about, in general, that, trauma is relational. So trauma is subjective, right? Like, I cannot tell you what's traumatizing you, and you cannot tell me what's traumatizing me, even though there are very, very clear indicatives of what it is. But everything that we go through is relational, I think, the way that I see it, because what trauma does is not really what happens to you, but how you live what happens to you. So usually what happens is that it breaks the relationships around you. It becomes isolating, it becomes fragmented. It's like you can no longer relate, not to yourself, not to others, not to the world in the way that you know it. And that's why I think understanding trauma from a relational perspective helps us understand healing from a relational perspective too. So if people say no, because it's all about me, like, the Miley Cyrus song of like, it's like, love me, give me some flowers. I don't know if I believe that so much. I think, being part of like relationships, about being cultivating relationships, by the way, you all know the study, the Harvard study that asked the question, who are the happiest people, the people that lived longer? Do you guys know this study? Everybody knows? Do you know the answer? So they've been doing this for 40 years or 80 years? 80 years, right? In generations. I mean, some of the researchers have died and other people have come along. They've done, okay, who is the happiest people and who live longer? They say, okay, maybe it's education. No. Maybe it's the amount of books that you have at home. No. Maybe it's the culture that you come from. Maybe it's the race. Maybe it's the amount of money that you have, the luxury, the health. And what they keep finding invariably is the one thing that really makes a difference is the quality of relationships that you have in your life. The quality. So it's not like you have 100 friends, it's how good those friends are. The quality of relationships in your family, in your friends, and that's what keeps people live longer and be healthier and happier. So we have to cultivate relationships.
Well, we thank you for this jewel. You will help so many people on the road to post-traumatic growth. Thank you.
Thank you so much.